and hello once again. We're back with a second panel here. In the first panel, we talked about the latest trends in the fintech sector and of course also just technologies and solutions that banking can really use to scale up their business. But we can't forget about that there is also risks that banks are facing today. So in this panel, we are actually tackling the risks in fintech. So we are focusing on the risks that our fintech companies today are facing and how to tackle the possible solutions as well here. We're also covering the question how to fight against crime in financial sector and combat also criminals with one of the leading anti-money laundering startups that we have today with us here. And of course also we are talking about the latest report that has been just published by Tallinn Technical University on Estonian fintech sector, so that we're going to see also what are the trends, the security side, and so on as well here. And I'm happy again once again to introduce our panelists here. First of all, we have here Mr. Lukas Ilves, who is the head of strategy in Guardtime company. So secondly, we have Mr. Taavi Tamkivi, who is the founder and CEO of Salv Technologies, so the money laundering company that I was talking about just before. And last, we have also here Dr. Laivi Laidro. She is the associate professor at Tallinn Technical University, so that she will help us to understand again the trends by the security also in a financial sector. To kick off with the very first topic in question here, when we talk about the banking sector, it is increasingly regulated also on counter money laundering side, different transactions and of course also activities in the banking sector. These kind of regulations are getting stricter and stricter all the time and often also affect banks' operations and customers face increasingly complex solutions also. This is what we have seen recently. How to find this kind of balance, or in other words, like a bliss point there, not to over-regulate, but at the still same time to keep our systems very secure. Which ways this kind of technology provided by Guardtime first, and then we're going to jump all the way to Salv, are helping to keep this kind of customer experience still very high at the same time, so that banks' customers can still sleep peacefully knowing that their information and data and money is safe where they have that. Let's start with you here,
Thank
Lucas.
you. So, I mean, I think I want to start with the big picture, which is that the architecture of how we move value around today, I wouldn't call it broken, but it's crumbling at the edges. And Taavi will talk about some very impressive work that Salv does to solve that problem with today's architecture. But I want to focus a little bit on tomorrow's architecture, because one of the things that we can do with blockchain and DLT technologies is we can find a new balance between the privacy and the secrecy requirements that people continue to have and expect of their money, and actually being able to conduct the large-scale analyses for AML and fraud detection that you need to carry out in today's economic world. So I mean, one of the things that the central banks that are looking at digital currencies have looked at, and that I think you'll see in crypto assets in the next few years, is that actually these technologies, which today are considered tools for money launderers, are actually going to offer ways of moving value and storing value that allow much more control over and transparency toward law enforcement. And the tricky part's going to be how we balance that transparency, which is ultimately a benefit of having a ledger that's shared and open, with the expectations that people have around privacy.
And we're going to come back to Lucas a little bit later also, as they are providing blockchain technology to also central banks and of course other financial institutions, also the role of that. But I will give the word now to Taavi. Maybe you can also explain this process, how not to over-regulate, but still how to keep the systems very secure.
I want to start with blockchain technologies that Lucas also mentioned, because there is a lot of transparency in the movement of value in these platforms. Like you can see wallets, you can see transactions, you can chase criminals, and it makes life much easier for the crime fighters and for the regulators to see what's going on over there. So that's really, really interesting area. But in the old sector, old banking and also old fintech sector, this kind of luxury doesn't exist yet, and that's what we're building with the bridge as well, to help those institutions to exchange information a bit more openly than they do today. But the main challenge or conflict is that regulated in this heavily regulated environment where your regulators are watching after you, your laws are telling exactly what you need to do. It's massive spend that banks and fintechs have to make in order to be compliant with everything. Exactly. And in this kind of environment, trying to be a bit innovative, to try new alternative things, to try to make things differently from the market practices, it needs really brave people, because like no one wants to take the risk that maybe I'm not compliant with GDPR, maybe we're not compliant with AML. And that's the major barrier that I see. Like regulators and FSAs can become more open, more supportive for the fintechs and for the banks, encouraging people to think more broadly about the core mission of the, like, why these crime-fighting regulators exist. They exist exactly as you explained, to keep people's money safe, to keep criminals away. And like, what's the way to that? Like, entrepreneurs and companies should have more freedom to select. And that's like reducing the control, reducing the pressure, and giving more openness for the people. That's like core basis of the better alternative, more effective ways to beat crime, to reduce the other risks in the banking sector.
Great. I would now jump to Laivi. We're so happy to have you with us today. I was reading the reports that Tallinn Technical University has published regarding the fintech sector, what are the trends, security risks, and so on and so on. It was very interesting for me to read that, but we do not have enough time to go through the entire report. I would really recommend for everybody to really read that through. But maybe you can do like a sum up of that. What has been the biggest outcomes of this report that were very surprising, or maybe not so surprising, but just that really made it clear that these are the challenges when we also talk about, for example, the security sector?
Thank you. I think that trying to be brief, the main point is that what we see is that the Estonian fintech sector is steadily growing. So it has not slowed down. Also, when looking at the composition of different types of fintechs who are active here, although there is a kind of greater presence of companies which are involved in digital assets, digital lending, digital payments, or enterprise services, then actually the overall landscape is still very diverse. So there exist these different opportunities for different types of fintechs. And when looking at the development of the local ecosystem, there are clear signs that the growth has been rapid, and it has been facilitated, first of all, by the very kind of informal communication, which is possible in a small country like Estonia between all these ecosystem participants, as well as the favorable entrepreneurial environment.
Yeah, you want to reflect on that?
Yes, I wanted to add also, because like I'm part of the Finance Estonia, and I was like working also to get like understanding of this data, and I was also really impressed and surprised by the number of companies that call themselves as a fintechs or who are participating in the study, which was like real surprise for me, although I've been many years in this industry. But also like I think maybe we've been holding ourselves back in Estonia, as we haven't realized what's the potential and what's the reputation globally. There are fintech associations around the world who are contacting us, want to become my friends, or like sign memorandums of understandings and other documents, just they want to learn from us. So, and if you think about the presentations that we heard today, also like people have tens and tens of experience in the core banking, in the financial technology, in the crypto space, and now like this is like merging into real business value for the country and the other countries who are related to us. So like this research study itself, it was like, wow, like it's really happening actually. It's not only WISE or it's not only like few other companies, but actually this, like, the ecosystem is booming here.
Yeah, and much bigger. So from the report also reflecting on that, what I was reading there, what I was surprised, like not surprised, but in a way like very happy to see that we can say that the impact of pandemic on the sector has been quite modest, I would say. The greatest challenge emerged from regulatory environment side, still all the regulations and so on. What, in your opinion, maybe I would let everybody to answer that question. How should financial institutions and government support fintech sector today?
I think when we look at our respondents, then it was clear that different types of fintechs are facing different regulatory challenges. But what was common is the desire for greater regulatory clarity. So to get more explanations on different types of requirements which are impacting fintechs. And this, I think, is one way to kind of help all the companies in the ecosystem.
Yeah, just to add that, to zoom out a bit, I'm also part of member of the European FinTech Association, which is gathering top fintechs around Europe. And it's a really small organization. And quite recently we have seen a really great number of other like large fintechs want to join this association. And we were just discussing why it's happening, or we haven't made like great advertising or anything, but some really cool like global companies based in Estonia want to join us. And like it seems to be that during the pandemics, European Parliament, the European Commission have understood the importance of the fintech sector. Like we as entrepreneurs, we have understood it 10 years ago, but now it's coming into really top political players that, okay, we need to pay more attention and we need to improve our laws and like regulations around them. And that's the reason why the global fintechs are now joining the unions and associations, because they see that there's interest on the Parliament side and Commission side to improve the legislation around us. So that's like really powerful thing that actually COVID has triggered for the whole ecosystem here. So.
You want to reflect?
Yeah, I mean, I think reflecting on both of your comments, one of the broader points that comes out of this is that fintechs aren't just about replacing what banks do, right? They're actually about expanding the scope of financialization and finance as a tool and money as a tool into areas that currently aren't impacted by that. Whether we're talking about using that to achieve sustainability and to marshal the investments we need to create incentives for that, or whether we're talking about healthcare and wellness. So in a sense, part of what this revolution is about is bringing a sort of money logic into all these domains. And I think this is something that Estonia is very well placed to do, because we have this interdisciplinary culture that in part comes from being small. And so you'll find sort of people from different domains converging. And we also have this background in digital government as a whole, which really touches on every domain. So if we can bring sort of the finance aspect into pretty much every domain of government, then we have effectively just about the entire gamut of digitization covered by our fintechs.
I will turn back to our audience as well and remind you, you do have a chance to ask questions to you. We have leading company providing blockchain, money laundering company as well here, and a person who was behind of this amazing report that I brought it out. So do use this chance and ask your questions. But now I will use this chance to continue kind of like on the same topic that we just discussed. And when we think about it in several, like the past few years or 10 years even, we see more and more cases of, again, money laundering, frauds in Go financing and so on. So there is plenty of cases like that. This has really made, I would say, public sector more aware of this issue. And they, of course, when we talked about like want to regulate that a little more, but this could also cause a case where the banking sector is becoming a little bit more closed. On a positive note side here, we see that the Ministry of Finance and Bank of Estonia have really like opened up and really wanted to have a little bit stronger communication than ever before that it has existed. One of the proposed solutions by both the companies and also from the public sector point of view was to have this kind of Go operations to map a cross-sectoral development plan. Do you think that Estonia has been successful with this, when we especially talk about mapping it and the communication between the public sector and now the companies as well?
Yeah, maybe again, to start from a bit of distance, like you mentioned, last 10 years or 5 years, just I like numbers, and like if I'm looking what's happening in the banking sector around the crime fighting, like if we're looking at world top biggest 50 banks, then about every like 1 out of 4 banks is getting fined. They've got fined over the last 10 years. So for the bankers and also for the people in the fintech industry, it's rather not a question, am I clean or not, or am I getting fined or not, but it's more about like when I'm getting it, because like the probability of being hit by some kind of regulatory burden or some kind of money laundering issue is huge. And like where I see it's coming actually, like what's triggering that or what's causing that, the money laundering itself or crime has been here for like hundreds of years or thousands of years. Yeah. But the point is that the social status, or like how people take it and how people perceive it, how they understand it, it's changing. Like from the people on the streets or newspaper readers, they are putting more pressures on the government, and government has to put more pressures on the financial sector. think about 5 years ago, there was Panama Papers, which came out that like in the Panama, rich people were hiding their taxes, and social reaction was so sharp through the media that like I think the bank accounts which were opened in Panama were closed down like almost 100%. Most of the banks in the world closed it down because of the social pressure that came to them through the government initiative, actually before even government initiative. And now this same thing is happening with like more classical financial crime, anti-money laundering, and governments feel that in order to keep their electors happy, they need to do something, and they need to put more pressure on the banks, which is like ultimately not ending up really well now, but actually that adds more resources, more attention for this innovation. And what's the exact plan? I haven't seen any good plans nowhere. It's more about encourage FIUs and FSAs to hire more smart people. Like in the industry side, we have like a lot of talents who know everything about crypto and who know everything about financial revolution. So if these kind of people would work also in the government sectors, then we can have more meaningful debate. It's not about closing down all the crypto companies in Estonia. It's more about like agreeing what kind of cryptos we want to allow here. Same with the fintech, same with different financial services. So it's like better experience and education in the government sector that will help definitely to get into better shape.
Well, definitely, and the crypto sector is definitely not very well regulated in most of the countries still today, even though that this is a very well used already currency as well. I would turn back to you, Lucas, and speak about the Guardtime. When people who have been following our panels and discussions here as well, and e-Estonia itself, then they know that Guardtime has a very long history helping secure Estonia's government infrastructure by using blockchain system called KSI, a blockchain system. What's the role of blockchain in the fintech sector? And maybe if you start talking about this also, can you talk about your collaboration or the role of using blockchain also in central banks?
Yep. So at the moment, it's a peripheral question for most of the fintech sector, right? There's a separate world of cryptocurrencies. There are sort of growing numbers of applications. Now in the last year with decentralized finance, we've started to see effectively algorithms functioning as banks and investment vehicles. But I think what's going to happen in the next few years is that as a technology, this is going to become an infrastructure that is used increasingly for existing retail and wholesale transactions. And so what we're going to see is what we might call traditional fintechs, as well as banks and financial institutions, turning to blockchain and turning to tokenization as a basic technological layer for how they move money around, how they process transactions, how they share data. And so we'll see really what is called in the blockchain space an infrastructure inversion, where today's financial services infrastructure gets layered on top of a blockchain-based infrastructure, but that in turn opens up a whole lot of new functionalities and ways of doing things. And among the parties that are doing this are central banks. I mean, central banks today are in a world of competition around money. They have to compete with cryptocurrencies. They're competing amongst each other. They're competing with privately issued monies. And that is driving them to go through a digital transformation of sorts and digitally transform cash into an asset that can be used digitally. And that naturally leads them to say, well, if we're going to issue a digital asset today, are we going to issue it as an account balance, or are we actually going to issue tokens that have programmability, that have security features, that have peer-to-peer capabilities, and that let us find a more interesting balance between privacy and the types of money laundering analyses that Tavi does. And what we're seeing is that I think central banks are going to also go in favor of a more tokenized architecture. So this is really going to become, in the next few years, the plumbing of everything around money.
Yeah, you want to...
Just to add, actually to ask on that, like, because like it's like technically and business-wise and academically, it's super exciting. But I'm always thinking, like, are the central banks actually ready to move, or are the things like you do? Yep. Is it more about like just showing that we're innovative and some fans are doing that, but actually, is it really happening in next year? So it's just a nice talk and incubation.
I think it's really happening. I think that it's going to be gradual. There's going to be a period where the existing infrastructures work in parallel. But the argument is no longer, the discussions are no longer about, oh, can we look cool and be innovative, but it's functionally, what are the benefits of one approach or another? And the big question that's always been there is, okay, there are clearly benefits in terms of programmability and automation. There are benefits in terms of security and transparency. Can you do the money laundering checks? Can you do the scalability? And I think what the work that central banks have done over the last couple of years have shown is, yes, you can. So I think we've moved beyond the, this is really cool innovation pilots into the let's actually roll up our sleeves phase of things. I think it'll probably still be a question of years, not months. Central banks are going to move slower than some commercial actors do, but we've crossed that threshold.
That's actually something which I've been always thinking, that we as entrepreneurs need to keep really close eye on these movements. Like in the crime fighting, maybe in academy as well, people are building fintechs. Like if it actually happens in the European level, then the whole market is very, very different. And we as startuppers, we need to build a complete new set of technology, which is a great opportunity.
We talked about the speed, and there is a question coming also from the audience side. Somebody was asking, how do you tackle the slow speed of regulations compared to what market demands are in such regulated field? Maybe I would turn to you, Laivi, to you. If you think about this issue, was there anything that came from the report also that was focusing on how we tackle this kind of slow speed of regulations and what's actually happening already in the market?
Unfortunately, there wasn't. So maybe colleagues from entrepreneurial side have more kind of insight to provide here.
As we can see from the smile from Tavi, then you have something to add here.
I don't have a statistical evidence for that, but what I see when speaking, especially with the smaller organizations, then they don't have a willingness or guts to challenge or interpret existing legislation. Actually, laws are pretty okay-ish, and they're pretty open, and like you can do a lot of creative things under that. I've been operating under, when I was in WISE, I was interpreting and reading laws myself, thinking with my head, and I really encourage large banks, but also fintechs, to think along with the laws and not only like getting stuck with, okay, lawyers are saying that, like I cannot do this, I cannot do that, I cannot do that one. But actually you can. It's just like interpreting the law in the right way, consulting with the regulators, and you can do it. It's not only about, only solution isn't about making new laws or changing it. It's about being smart about what we have already.
Yeah.
One point I would make is that at the end of the day, what we all want as startups is we want to have regulators that in their primary regulatory capacity are flexible and sensible, and not necessarily sandboxes, because sandboxes can actually end up becoming sand traps, where you basically, you get to play with an innovative project or two, but then you're waiting for approval for months or years. And so ultimately what regulators need to do is treat everyone on a similar basis, but then also make themselves more approachable. Because frequently for smaller companies, it's precisely these layers of bureaucracy that you have to get through, uncertainty, and a lack of a human face even on the regulator's side, which if you're a big bank maybe has been solved. If you're a small actor, you need to have a place to start.
I would take the last question as well, which also came from one of our listeners today. How to get more fintech people involved in government processes? Yeah, anybody you want to add? And
that's what I really love here in Estonia. It's super easy as entrepreneur to get into contact with government members, with government agencies, to explain what we're doing, why we're doing. So come to Estonia, found your company here.
That's what I was about to say as well. Estonia is a small country. Everybody know each other, and especially the circle of people who are very active and also in this sector. You want to add, and then I will let...
If you're from a government and you're listening, all I'd say is just call them up, write them an email, because generally if you get called by a regulator and or by someone in government and they're not calling to impose a fine, you actually want to talk to them, you're interested in what they've got to say, and generally most of these fintechs are pretty approachable.
So it's easy to get into contact with ex-presidents and stuff.
Well, in Estonia, yes, if we talk about countries that have a little bit more people, then I guess this is more tricky, but of course you can find your channels. Any suggestion from your side, and then we can finish
I think the cooperation is the key. And not just between the fintechs and government, but all ecosystem players, and also amongst fintechs.
Yeah.
So how to kind of push together, initiate something. So these are the solutions.
Yeah.